The Riverside Iron Works fell silent at noon on Saturday, October 14th, 1893. For the first time in 4 months, the charging bell ceased its rhythm. The steam hammers went still, and in the eastern corner of the foundry floor, beneath a vault of smoke-stained brick, the blast furnace was sealed and banked for its quarterly maintenance shutdown. The last load of iron had been tapped at 11:45. The tires were closed, cutting off the blast. The charging bridge was locked in position, hopper doors latched. 3 men remained to complete the banking procedure, shoveling a protective layer of coke dust across the exposed hearth, sealing inspection ports with iron plates, threading safety chains through the tap hole covers. By 1:30, the work was finished. The furnace sat in darkness, entombed in its own structure, waiting to cool. Joseph Carrick, the Saturday foreman, placed his bare palm against the outer shell before leaving. The cast iron casing radiated heat like a stove door in December. He expected this. The furnace had been running at 2200 degrees for weeks. The refractory lining alone, 3 feet of firebrick backed by 18 inches of common brick, held more heat than 100 locomotives. It would take days to cool, perhaps a week before a man could enter the stack for inspection. This was understood. This was normal. What Carrick did not expect, what no one expected, was what they would find on Monday morning. The weekend passed without incident. Sunday rain drummed on the foundry roof. The building breathed its familiar smells: coal dust, scale, oil, the sharp mineral tang of spent flux. Through the high windows, pale light reached the furnace structure, illuminating the arch of the charging bridge, the vertical lines of the uptake, the circular platform where the bell mechanism hung suspended. Structure stood like a cathedral pillar, 40 feet of engineered masonry rising from a stone foundation to a steel-braced crown, silence and shadow, the expectation of cooling. But inside the walls, in the dark spaces between brick courses, in the labyrinth of the refractory lining, something else was happening. Heat was not simply dissipating. It was moving, circulating, reorganizing itself within the thermal mass of the structure in ways that would not be fully understood for another 30 years. On Monday morning, when the day shift arrived and the foundry roared back to life around the silent furnace, the first man to approach the structure would stop mid-stride, confused by what his hand told him. The outer casing should have cooled. The iron should have surrendered its heat to the October air. Instead, it was warm, not scalding, but distinctly, impossibly warm, as if the furnace had forgotten it was supposed to die. Thomas Brennan arrived at 5:40 Monday morning, 15 minutes before the shift bell. He was a tap-hole borer, 31 years old, methodical in his routines. His first task each day was to inspect the furnace even when it wasn't running, checking for cracks in the casing, loose bolts on the uptake collar, any sign of distress in the structure. On a banking weekend, this inspection took on additional importance. A cooling furnace could develop stress fractures. Moisture could penetrate compromised joints. Small problems discovered early prevented catastrophic failures later. He approached from the south side, where morning light from the clerestory windows illuminated the lower shell. His right hand reached out automatically, fingers spread, palm down, the standard test for surface temperature. He expected cool iron, perhaps slightly warm near the hearth level. His hand stopped 6 inches from the casing. Heat radiated against his skin. Not the blast of an active furnace, but a persistent warmth, like standing near a banked forge. He closed the distance slowly. The iron was warm enough to be uncomfortable for prolonged contact. He moved his hand upward along the shell, mapping the temperature by sensation. At 8 feet, still warm. At 12 feet, warmer than it should be. At the belly of the furnace, 15 feet up, the casing held enough heat to make him pull back after 3 seconds. Brennan stepped away, frowning. He walked the perimeter. The entire structure radiated heat in a way that seemed wrong for a furnace banked 60 hours prior. He'd worked this furnace through 2 previous shutdowns. By Monday morning, you could keep your hand on the casing indefinitely. This was different. He found Joseph Carrick near the charging floor, reviewing maintenance schedules with the day foreman. Brennan described what he'd felt. Carrick set down his clipboard and walked back with him to the furnace. Both men placed their palms against the lower shell simultaneously. Carrick held his hand there for 5 seconds, then moved it higher, testing. His expression shifted from skepticism to something more careful. "It hasn't cooled," Brennan said. "It's cooled some." Carrick replied. But not enough. He looked up at the stack rising into shadow. Not nearly enough. By mid-morning, word had spread through the foundry. Men found excuses to pass by the furnace, to touch the casing, to confirm what others were saying. The structure was warm, unaccountably warm. Frank Dietrich, who had tended this furnace for 9 years, pressed his cheek against the iron and stood very still, listening. He reported hearing something, not the roar of combustion, but a subtle sound, almost rhythmic, like distant breathing. Others tried to hear it and couldn't. Dietrich insisted it was there. The smell was wrong too. Not dramatically wrong, but off in a way the experienced men noticed. A cooling furnace smelled of carbon and cold iron oxide, sharp, mineral, inert. This furnace smelled faintly of heat. There was a dry, baked quality to the air near the structure, as if the bricks themselves were exhaling warmth. Someone mentioned bread ovens. Someone else said it reminded him of lime kilns days after firing. The analogies were imprecise, but the observation was consistent. The furnace smelled like something still holding temperature, still active in some invisible way. By noon, measurements were attempted. A maintenance man climbed the access ladder and held a thermometer against the casing at 20 feet. The mercury climbed to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. He moved to 30 feet, 130 degrees. The superintendent was summoned. He listened to the reports, felt the casing himself, and ordered the inspection port on the east side opened. 2 men unbolted the iron plate covering a 4-inch square opening at the 12-foot level. Heat rolled out, not a blast, but a steady exhalation of warm air. They waited for it to equalize, then peered inside with a hand lamp. The light revealed the inner surface of the refractory lining, dull red brick, completely dark, no visible glow. But the heat coming through that small opening was enough to make both men sweat. They closed the port and stepped back. Something inside the furnace was holding temperature in defiance of all expectation. The structure refused to cool, and no one could explain why. Tuesday morning brought no relief. If anything, the situation intensified. The casing temperature, measured at multiple points, had not decreased. In some locations, particularly around the Bosch and lower stack, it had risen slightly. Men touched the iron with increasing wariness, pulling back quickly, exchanging looks that mixed confusion with something approaching unease. The sounds became more distinct. Throughout Tuesday, workers reported hearing periodic ticking noises from within the structure, sharp metallic clicks that seemed to travel up the shell. These were expansion sounds, the kind heard in any large iron structure responding to temperature change. But they should have been contraction sounds, the slow settling of cooling metal. Instead, the ticks suggested ongoing movement, ongoing adjustment, as if the furnace were still actively heating rather than passively cooling. Frank Dietrich spent his lunch break sitting on a tool chest 20 feet from the base of the furnace, watching it. He told others later that he could see heat shimmer in the air above the stack crown, the kind of distortion you see over hot pavement in August. This was disputed. The foundry was poorly lit and full of ambient heat from other operations, but Dietrich was adamant. The air above the furnace moved differently. It rose. It carried heat upward in a column. By Wednesday, the phenomenon had attracted attention beyond the foundry floor. Mill engineers arrived with notebooks and instruments. They took systematic temperature readings using contact thermometers at marked intervals around the circumference and height of the casing. The data confirmed what the workers already knew. The outer shell maintained temperatures between 120 and 150 degrees Fahrenheit over most of its surface, with hot spots near the hearth reaching 170 degrees. For a furnace 3 days into a cold shutdown, these numbers were inexplicable. One engineer climbed to the charging platform and lowered a thermometer on a wire through the bell mechanism into the stack interior. The instrument descended 20 feet before the wire stopped. He waited 5 minutes, then retrieved it. The thermometer read 340 degrees. He lowered it again, this time allowing it to descend 30 feet. When pulled up, 410 degrees. Deep inside the structure, in the dark shaft where no combustion was occurring, the temperature remained high enough to ignite paper. The hum that Dietrich had first described became audible to others. It wasn't constant. It came and went, more prominent in the early morning and late evening when the foundry quieted. Maintenance workers described it as a low-frequency drone, felt as much as heard, emanating from somewhere within the brick mass. One man compared it to the sound of wind in a cave. Another said it reminded him of a note sung by telegraph wires. The source remained mysterious. Wednesday afternoon brought the first physical evidence of internal movement. A younger worker named Samuel Polk was tasked with checking the tap hole cover, ensuring the seal remained tight. He approached the hearth level and immediately noticed something wrong. The iron plate covering the tap hole was discolored, not with rust or scale, but with heat bloom, a rainbow pattern of oxidation that forms on steel exposed to high temperature. The plate had been cool when installed Saturday. Now it showed thermal stress marks radiating from the edges. Polk touched the plate briefly. It was hot enough to sting. He called for the superintendent. When the cover was removed, heat poured from the tap hole like water from a pipe. The stream of warm air was strong enough to deflect a piece of paper held nearby. The interior of the hearth, visible through the opening as a black void, exhaled steady warmth. No glow, no flame, just heat, escaping under pressure as if the furnace were breathing. The cover was quickly replaced, but the observation was deeply unsettling. Heat was not merely remaining in the structure. It was moving through it, following pathways, emerging from specific points. The furnace was behaving not like a cooling mass of brick and iron, but like a living thermal system, redistributing energy according to rules no one present understood. That night, the superintendent ordered round-the-clock observation. A man would remain posted near the furnace at all times, recording any changes. The mill could not restart the furnace until the quarterly inspection was complete, and the inspection could not proceed while the interior remained dangerously hot. They were caught in a strange stalemate, waiting for a structure that refused to surrender its heat. Thursday morning, the observer on the midnight shift reported that the hum had grown louder around 3 a.m., then faded by dawn. He also noted that the warmest point on the casing had shifted, moving slowly upward over the course of the night, as if heat were climbing the interior walls. When the day shift verified this with thermometer readings, the realization settled over the engineering team like cold water. They were not dealing with simple thermal retention. They were witnessing heat in motion, circulating through the furnace structure in ways that defied their understanding of how masonry and iron should behave. The first theory emerged Thursday afternoon during a meeting in the superintendent's office. 6 men crowded around a table covered with technical drawings of the furnace cross-section. The superintendent, 2 mill engineers, the furnace foreman, and Joseph Carrick. Someone, no one later remembered who, suggested that fire might still be burning somewhere inside the structure. The idea had surface logic. The furnace had run for months. Fuel residue could have collected in unexpected places. Pockets of coke lodged in crevices of the brickwork. Fragments of unburned coal trapped in the slag-coated lower chambers. Perhaps a small fire was smouldering in some hidden space, feeding on this residual fuel, generating just enough heat to keep the entire structure warm. They discussed access points. The furnace had inspection ports at 4 levels, the tap hole at the hearth, and the charging bell at the crown. Opening these sequentially might reveal smoke, flame, or the glow of hidden combustion. But opening them also meant releasing whatever heat was trapped inside, potentially creating dangerous backdrafts or exposing workers to sudden blasts of hot gas. Friday morning, they proceeded carefully, starting with the lowest port, a 6-inch opening 8 feet above the foundation. They removed the cover plate and inserted a long iron rod. If fire burned inside, the rod would heat along its length. They left it in place for 10 minutes, then withdrew it. The end that had been inside was warm but not hot. No glow, no discoloration. They repeated the test at higher ports with identical results. Warmth, but no evidence of combustion. Frank Dietrich proposed a different theory. He'd worked furnaces in Pennsylvania where gas pockets sometimes formed in the brickwork, volatile compounds released from the mortar or trapped during construction. These gases could smolder slowly, heatlessly, releasing energy over days. It wasn't fire, exactly. It was more like chemical decomposition, a slow oxidation that produced warmth without flame. An engineer countered that such gases would have burned off during the furnace's initial firing 3 years prior. Any volatile compounds in the mortar or brick would have been consumed in the first weeks of operation. Dietrich disagreed. He'd seen old furnaces develop strange behaviors after years of use. The heat and stress changed the brick somehow, made it chemically active in ways that fresh brick wasn't. The argument went in circles. By Saturday, 1 week into the shutdown, a third theory took hold among the workers, though no one voiced it in official meetings. The furnace had been pushed too hard during its last campaign. 4 months of continuous operation, some days running hotter than rated capacity to meet production demands. Perhaps the structure itself had been damaged. Perhaps cracks had formed deep in the refractory lining, and heat was leaking from these hidden fractures into the surrounding brickwork, spreading through the walls like water through sand. This theory prompted a careful external inspection. Men on ladders examined every visible inch of the outer casing and masonry shell, looking for cracks, displaced bricks, any sign of structural failure. They found nothing. The exterior was intact. Whatever was happening inside the furnace left no evidence on its surface. The most troubling theory came from an older maintenance worker named George Talbot, who had witnessed a furnace failure in Ohio years before. He suggested quietly that the refractory lining might be collapsing. If the inner wall of firebrick was falling away in sections, the rubble would pile in the hearth, creating an insulating mass that trapped heat. The structure would cool far more slowly than expected because the failed lining would act like a blanket over the residual warmth. This theory was taken seriously enough to warrant investigation. On Sunday, a man was lowered partway into the stack from the charging bridge, suspended on ropes, carrying a lantern. He descended 30 feet, examining the inner wall as he went. His report was definitive. The refractory lining appeared sound. No collapse, no fallen brick. The walls were smooth, intact, showing only the normal wear of long service. Whatever was keeping the furnace warm, it wasn't structural failure. By Monday, 8 days into shutdown, the theories had exhausted themselves. Hidden fire, disproven. Gas decomposition, unlikely. Structural damage, ruled out. The engineers sat in the superintendent's office, staring at temperature logs that showed virtually no decrease in casing warmth. If anything, the readings had stabilized, as if the furnace had reached some kind of equilibrium. Not cooling, not heating, simply maintaining itself at a temperature that should have been impossible to sustain without fuel. Someone mentioned masonry mass. Brick held heat. Everyone knew that. The furnace contained thousands of tons of it. Perhaps they had simply underestimated how long that much thermal mass would take to cool, but the calculations didn't support this. Even accounting for the full mass of the refractory and backing layers, the structure should have cooled significantly by now. Heat dissipation didn't work the way they were observing. Temperature should decrease predictably, logarithmically. This furnace was defying the curve. They were missing something. Some principle of heat behavior in large masonry structures that wasn't covered in their engineering manuals. The furnace was teaching them that their understanding was incomplete, and it was doing so slowly, persistently, with the patience of stone. The breakthrough in understanding began with careful observation rather than theory. On the 9th day of shutdown, Joseph Carrick spent 2 hours methodically touching the casing at 1-foot intervals, mapping the temperature distribution by hand. He worked from the foundation upward, pausing at each point to gauge warmth, then recording his impressions in a notebook. What he discovered was subtle but significant. The heat was not distributed randomly. It formed patterns. The warmest zone was no longer at the hearth level where the last heat had been introduced. It had migrated upward, settling in the Bosch region, the widest part of the furnace belly, about 18 feet above the foundation. From this central hot zone, warmth radiated outward and upward, but not uniformly. The eastern side of the casing was consistently 5 to 8 degrees cooler than the western side. The northern quadrant showed a gradual temperature decline from bottom to top, while the southern quadrant showed something stranger. Alternating bands of warmer and cooler iron, each band roughly 2 feet wide, stacked vertically up the shell. Carrick showed his notes to Frank Dietrich. Together they returned to the furnace and verified the pattern. The banded temperature variation was real. They could feel it clearly. warm band, cooler band, warm band, ascending the south face like invisible stripes. Dietrich placed both hands on the casing and closed his eyes, moving them slowly upward. "It's like the heat is layered," he said, "like something is holding it in sections." This observation triggered a memory. Dietrich recalled a lecture he'd attended years before about heat retention in brick ovens. The speaker had described how baking chambers with thick walls didn't cool uniformly. Instead, heat moved through the brick structure in complex patterns, driven by differences in density, by moisture trapped in the mortar, by the way individual courses of brick were laid. The lecturer had used the term thermal currents, flows of warmth through masonry that behaved almost like water flowing through porous stone. That evening, Dietrich shared this information with the mill engineers. One of them, a younger man named Howard Pierce, recently graduated from technical college, became animated. He asked detailed questions about the furnace construction. How were the refractory bricks laid? What mortar was used? How many distinct layers made up the walls? Were there air gaps anywhere in the structure? Their answers, extracted from construction documents and from the memory of older workers, revealed complexity no one had fully considered. The furnace wasn't a simple wall of brick. It was a composite structure, an inner layer of firebrick, highly resistant to heat but relatively porous, a middle layer of hard brick, denser but less heat-resistant, an outer layer of common brick for structural support, and finally, the iron casing. Between these layers were thin spaces, not intentional air gaps, but the inevitable irregularities that occurred during construction. Mortar joints of varying thickness, small voids where bricks didn't sit perfectly flush. Microchannels created by the way courses overlapped. Pierce suggested that these spaces might allow air movement. If temperature differences existed within the wall structure, convection could occur. Warm air rising through tiny channels, cool air sinking, creating circulation loops entirely contained within the thickness of the masonry. This circulation would redistribute heat, moving it from the hot inner surface to the cooler outer layers, then allowing it to sink back down as it cooled, only to be reheated and rise again. The wall itself would become a heat engine, operating on the temperature differential between inside and outside. The idea was met with skepticism. The spaces between bricks were tiny, irregular, probably blocked by mortar in most places. How could meaningful air circulation occur through such a fractured network? Pierce argued that it didn't require large open channels. Even microscopic movement through porous brick, if sustained over days, could transport significant heat. The total volume of the walls was enormous. Tiny flows, multiplied across thousands of cubic feet of masonry, could amount to substantial thermal energy transfer. To test this, they devised a simple experiment. Late Tuesday afternoon, they opened 3 inspection ports simultaneously, one low on the north side, one midway up the south side, one high on the west side. If air was circulating inside the walls, opening these ports might disrupt the flow pattern and cause detectable changes in surface temperature. They monitored the casing temperature around each opened port for 4 hours. The results were ambiguous but suggestive. Around the lower north port, the casing temperature dropped 3 degrees in the first hour, then stabilized. Around the mid-level south port, temperature remained constant. Around the upper west port, temperature actually increased slightly, perhaps from heat escaping through the opening and warming the external shell around it. More interesting was what they felt at the ports themselves. At the lower opening, cool air seemed to be drawn in, a gentle but definite inward draft. At the upper opening, warm air flowed out. The direction of airflow suggested circulation. Cool air entering low, warm air exiting high, with internal pathways connecting them through the labyrinth of the wall structure. They closed the ports and continued monitoring. Over the next 24 hours, the temperature patterns gradually returned to their previous configuration, the warm bands, the hot zone at the Bosch, the east-west differential. It was as if the circulation system had re-established itself, finding new pathways or reopening old ones, reorganizing the heat distribution back to some preferred state. Wednesday afternoon brought another observation, this one acoustic. A worker repairing a steam pipe near the furnace noticed that the metallic ticking sound seemed to correspond with the faint hum. When the hum intensified, the ticking increased. When the hum faded, the ticking slowed. He mentioned this to Dietrich, who spent an hour listening carefully to the structure. What Dietrich heard was rhythm. The sounds weren't random. They occurred in loose patterns, clusters of clicks separated by periods of relative quiet. He described it as almost musical, not melodic, but structured, like a very slow percussion piece. The hum provided a bass note, continuous but varying in intensity. The clicks punctuated this drone at irregular intervals, faster during some periods, slower during others. Pierce suggested the sounds might be related to expansion and contraction cycles driven by the internal heat circulation. As warm air rose through channels in the wall, it would heat the surrounding brick and iron, causing expansion. As cooler air descended elsewhere, contraction would occur. These micro-movements, occurring throughout the massive structure, would create stress points where metal and masonry met, and these stress points would release as audible clicks when the strain exceeded some threshold. The varying intensity of the hum might reflect changes in the rate of circulation. Faster flow producing more friction, slower flow producing less. This explanation was elegant but unproven. No one had instruments sensitive enough to measure air velocity through brick walls or expansion forces in specific structural joints. The sounds remained evidence of something happening, but exactly what remained speculation. What was becoming clear, however, was that the furnace was not simply a passive container of heat, slowly radiating warmth until exhaustion. It was an active system, a thermal machine that used its own structure to circulate, redistribute, and preserve heat through mechanisms more complex than anyone had anticipated. The refusal to cool was not stubbornness, it was function. The furnace was doing exactly what its architecture enabled it to do, maintaining temperature through emergent behaviors that existed nowhere in the construction drawings, but everywhere in the actual built form. By the 13th day of shutdown, the Riverside Iron Works situation had attracted outside attention. A consulting engineer from Philadelphia arrived Wednesday morning, summoned by the mill owners who were growing concerned about the extended delay. His name was Dr. Marcus Henning, a specialist in furnace design and thermal engineering who had published papers on refractory materials and heat retention in industrial structures. Henning spent the first day simply observing. He walked slowly around the furnace, stopping frequently to place his hand on the casing, to listen, to examine joints and seams. He climbed to the charging platform and peered down into the dark stack. He studied the construction drawings for 2 hours, making notes in the margins. He spoke little, asked pointed questions, and maintained an expression of concentration that gave no indication of his thoughts. Thursday morning, he assembled the mill engineers and senior foundry workers in the superintendent's office. He spread the construction drawings across the table and began his explanation. His voice was precise, methodical, the tone of someone accustomed to teaching complex subjects. "Gentlemen," he began, "what you are witnessing is not malfunction. It is an unintended but entirely natural consequence of how you built this furnace and how you operated it. To understand what's occurring, we need to consider 3 factors: thermal mass, structural geometry, and what I call thermal memory." He pointed to the cross-section drawing showing the furnace wall composition. "Your refractory lining consists of firebrick, highly porous, with significant air content. This porosity gives it excellent insulation properties, but also means it contains thousands of small voids. When this brick is heated to 2200 degrees for months, several things happen. First, any residual moisture in the brick and mortar is driven deep into the wall structure. It doesn't escape, it migrates inward away from the heat, condensing in the cooler layers behind. Second, chemical changes occur in the mortar. Calcium compounds can decompose and reform. Silicates can undergo phase transitions. These are slow processes, but they store energy. He moved his finger to the backing courses. Behind your firebrick is hard brick, and behind that common brick. Each layer has different thermal properties, different heat capacity, different conductivity. This creates what we call thermal resistance at each boundary. Heat doesn't flow smoothly through these transitions. It accumulates at the interfaces, and these accumulation points can become sources of delayed heat release. Joseph Carrick spoke up. But it's been nearly 2 weeks. Surely the heat should have dissipated by now, regardless of how it's layered. Henning nodded. Under normal circumstances, yes, but your furnace is not a normal circumstance. Let me explain the geometry factor. He traced the curved profile of the furnace on the drawing. Your structure is roughly cylindrical with a pronounced belly, a Bosch. This shape is optimal for iron smelting, but also creates optimal conditions for internal convection. The air spaces between brick courses, the micro-channels through porous firebrick, the vertical gaps behind the lining, all of these connect in ways that allow air circulation. He sketched a quick diagram showing circular flow paths. Heated air rises through channels near the hot inner surface. As it rises, it heats the surrounding brick. At the top, it spreads outward into cooler zones, then descends along the outer layers as it cools. At the bottom, it's drawn back toward the center to be reheated. This creates a convection loop, a thermal engine that requires no external power. The temperature differential itself drives the circulation. Frank Dietrich leaned forward. You're saying the furnace is keeping itself warm? More accurately, Henning replied. The structure is preventing rapid cooling by redistributing heat internally. Instead of all the heat radiating outward from the center, the circulation system moves heat from hot zones to cooler zones before it can escape. This dramatically extends the cooling time. A solid brick cylinder would cool in a predictable manner. Your furnace, with its layered construction and internal pathways, cools far more slowly because the heat keeps finding new places to hide within the structure. One of the mill engineers asked about the sounds, the clicking and humming. Henning addressed this carefully. The clicking is thermal expansion, as you've surmised, but it's not random. The circulation patterns create zones of heating and cooling that move slowly through the structure. As these zones shift, they cause localized expansion and contraction. The structure literally breathes, and the breathing has rhythm. And the hum? Dietrich asked. That's more speculative, Henning admitted. But I believe it's resonance. Your structure is 40 feet tall with a hollow core surrounded by walls that are themselves hollow in a sense, filled with tiny voids and channels. Air moving through this structure at certain rates could excite acoustic resonances, much like blowing across the mouth of a bottle. The frequency would be very low, below the normal range of human hearing, but perceptible as vibration. Changes in circulation rate would change the resonance frequency, causing the hum to rise and fall. The room was silent as the men absorbed this. Finally, the superintendent asked the practical question. How long until we can inspect the interior? Henning consulted his notes. Based on the current temperature readings, and assuming the circulation continues as I believe it will, I would estimate another week, possibly 10 days, before the stack is cool enough for safe entry. The process cannot be accelerated without risking damage to the structure. If you open major access points to vent heat, you'll disrupt the pressure balance that's maintaining the circulation. This could cause rapid temperature changes that would crack the refractory lining. He paused, then added, what you must understand is that this furnace has been operating continuously for 4 months. During that time, it absorbed an enormous quantity of thermal energy, not just in the firebrick directly exposed to the heat, but in every layer of the structure, even the outer casing. The total heat content is staggering. That energy has to go somewhere, and it's going slowly through every available pathway. Your furnace isn't refusing to cool. It's cooling as fast as its architecture allows. The architecture, unfortunately for your schedule, is extremely efficient at heat retention. The Riverside Iron Works furnace finally cooled enough for interior inspection on the 23rd day of shutdown, more than 3 weeks after banking. The delay cost the mill significantly in lost production, but the structure survived intact. The quarterly inspection revealed normal wear, no unexpected damage, and the furnace returned to service without incident. For several years, the episode was discussed among foundry workers as a curiosity, an unexplained anomaly in an otherwise routine operation. The full engineering explanation would not emerge until decades later, assembled gradually through advances in thermodynamics, material science, and industrial heat transfer research conducted at universities and technical institutes across America and Europe. By the 1920s, Researchers studying industrial furnaces began to understand what had occurred at Riverside in 1893, not as a unique event, but as an extreme example of principles that operated in all large refractory structures. The phenomenon was thermal mass persistence, amplified by structural convection and sustained by multiple energy storage mechanisms operating simultaneously. First, the sheer quantity of material. The Riverside furnace contained approximately 400 tons of firebrick, 600 tons of backing brick, and 200 tons of iron casing and structural steel. At operating temperature, this mass held roughly 12 billion British thermal units of energy, equivalent to the heat produced by burning 150 tons of coal. This energy could not simply vanish. It had to dissipate through radiation, convection to surrounding air, and conduction through the foundation. Even under ideal conditions, this dissipation would take weeks for a structure of such enormous thermal mass. But conditions were not ideal. The layered construction created thermal resistance between zones. The firebrick layer, porous and insulating, conducted heat poorly to the backing courses. The backing brick, denser but still a poor conductor, slowed heat transfer to the outer wall. Each interface between layers acted as a thermal bottleneck, forcing heat to accumulate rather than flow freely outward. The result was stratification, temperature layers that persisted within the structure, each layer cooling at its own rate, isolated from adjacent zones by the thermal resistance of the materials. Second, the internal convection loops that Dr. Henning had identified were real and significant. Later studies using tracer gases in experimental furnace structures confirmed that air circulation through microchannels and porous brick could transport substantial heat. In a structure the size of the Riverside furnace, with a strong temperature gradient between the hot core and cooler exterior, convection currents could move continuously for days or weeks. These currents didn't keep the furnace hot, exactly. They redistributed heat, pulling warmth from the inner layers and depositing it in the middle zones of the wall, where it would then radiate slowly outward. The effect was to create a thermal buffer, a moving reservoir of heat that delayed the cooling of the entire structure. Third, and perhaps most surprising, was the role of chemical processes in the mortar and brick. Modern analysis revealed that calcium hydroxide in lime mortar undergoes dehydration at high temperatures, absorbing energy. This dehydrated material can later rehydrate when exposed to moisture, releasing that stored energy as heat. The Riverside furnace, after months of operation, had driven moisture from its mortar deep into the cooler outer zones of the wall. During shutdown, this moisture slowly migrated back toward the warmer center, rehydrating dehydrated compounds and releasing heat in the process. The effect was small, perhaps only 1% of the total thermal energy, but it occurred continuously, providing a low-level heat source that sustained the circulation and slowed overall cooling. Additionally, researchers discovered that slag residues and iron oxides within used refractory brick can undergo slow oxidation when exposed to air. During operation, these materials exist in a reduced state, depleted of oxygen. When the furnace is sealed and begins to cool, air trapped in the brick structure allows gradual reoxidation. This chemical reaction is exothermic. It releases heat. Again, the total energy involved is small relative to the thermal mass, but it's continuous. For days after shutdown, the brickwork itself acts as a weak but persistent heat source. The acoustic phenomena, the hum and clicking, were eventually explained through vibration analysis. Large masonry structures heated unevenly undergo continuous microseismic activity, tiny movements, as different sections expand and contract at different rates. These movements can excite mechanical resonances in the structure, particularly when the structure contains a large hollow space, like a furnace stack. The fundamental resonance frequency of the Riverside furnace, calculated years later from its dimensions, was approximately 8 Hz, below the threshold of clear hearing, but well within the range of tactile perception. Variations in internal air pressure from convection currents would modulate this resonance, creating the rise and fall that workers had described as breathing. The most complete study of the phenomenon appeared in a 1927 monograph by Dr. Heinrich Braun, a German engineer who investigated thermal behavior in blast furnaces across Europe. Braun documented 15 cases of unexpectedly slow cooling in large refractory structures. He developed mathematical models that predicted cooling times based on mass, layering, porosity, and chemical composition. His models showed that for a furnace the size of Riverside's, operating at the temperatures and duration it had experienced, a cooling period of 3 to 4 weeks was not anomalous. It was, in fact, precisely what the physics predicted, if one accounted for all the mechanisms simultaneously. 1523. Braun's work introduced the concept of thermal memory, the tendency of large heat-engineered structures to retain not just warmth, but patterns of warmth, circulation pathways that once established would persist long after the external heat source was removed. He described furnaces as thermal ecosystems, complex enough to develop emergent behaviors that existed nowhere in their design specifications, but everywhere in their actual operation. By the mid-20th century, these principles were standard knowledge in industrial thermal engineering. Modern furnace designs account for thermal mass effects, include features to accelerate or control cooling, and operators plan maintenance shutdowns with realistic expectations about cooling times. But in 1893, this understanding did not exist. The workers and engineers at Riverside were confronting phenomena at the edge of their knowledge, trying to explain behaviors that would require decades of research to fully comprehend. What they witnessed was not supernatural. It was superphysical, physics operating at a scale and complexity that exceeded contemporary understanding. The furnace that refused to cool was simply a machine doing what machines do, following the laws that govern energy, matter, and time, indifferent to human schedules and human confusion. The Riverside furnace ran for another 18 years after the incident of 1893. It was rebuilt twice, finally decommissioned in 1911 when the mill expanded and newer, larger furnaces replaced the older equipment. The structure was dismantled carefully, the bricks sorted for reuse, the iron casing cut up for scrap. No physical trace of it remains today. But the memory persisted, passed down through the oral tradition of foundry workers and recorded in the technical journals where engineers documented unusual occurrences. The story became a teaching case, referenced in thermodynamics courses and furnace operation manuals. It served as a reminder that industrial structures, particularly those that processed enormous quantities of heat, were more complex than they appeared, that understanding their behavior required accounting for factors invisible to direct observation. The men who worked at Riverside in October 1893 did not have the vocabulary to fully explain what they experienced. They did not know about convection loops in porous brick, or phase change heat storage in mortar, or resonance frequencies in hollow structures. What they had was careful observation, a willingness to measure and document, and enough epistemic humility to recognize when something exceeded their current understanding. Frank Dietrich, who lived until 1934, occasionally told the story to younger foundry workers. In his telling, the furnace that refused to cool became a lesson about patience and respect for industrial processes. "You can't bully heat," he would say. "Heat goes where it goes at the speed it goes. A big furnace has its own time, and you wait for it. That's not stubbornness. That's mass." Joseph Carrick, who eventually became superintendent of the entire works, kept a notebook from that October. The pages contain temperature readings, sketches of the furnace cross-section, and notes on the sounds and smells. On the final page, written after the furnace had cooled and returned to service, is a single sentence: "We built better than we knew." This is the paradox at the heart of large-scale industrial construction. Engineers design structures based on principles they understand, but the structures, once built and operated, exhibit behaviors that emerge from the interaction of those principles in ways no drawing can predict. The Riverside furnace was designed to smelt iron. What it also did, incidentally, inadvertently, was store and circulate heat with remarkable efficiency. creating a thermal system sophisticated enough that it took 30 years of research across multiple countries to fully explain. The industrial age created thousands of such structures: furnaces, boilers, kilns, refineries, reactors. Each was built to perform a specific function, but each also became a physical experiment in thermodynamics, materials science, and fluid dynamics. The machines taught their builders. The structures that survived were the ones that revealed something true about how energy and matter behaved at industrial scale. In this sense, the furnace that refused to cool was not malfunctioning. It was teaching. The lesson was about time, the time embedded in heated masonry, the time required for energy to dissipate through layered materials, the time that structures operating at extreme temperatures needed to return to ambient conditions. Industrial time was not human time. Industrial processes had their own rhythms, their own necessities, their own refusal to be rushed beyond what physics allowed. Modern blast furnaces cool faster, not because physics has changed, but because designers learned to account for thermal mass, to include forced ventilation, to reduce wall thickness where possible, to eliminate or minimize the features that in earlier furnaces had inadvertently created such efficient heat retention. We have learned, through experience and research, to build structures that do exactly what we want and nothing more. Machines optimized, controlled, predictable. But something was lost in that optimization. The old furnaces, with their thick walls and layered construction, their internal pathways and trapped air spaces, possessed a kind of thermal presence that modern structures lack. They were heavy with accumulated heat, slow to respond, difficult to control, but also robust, forgiving of operational variations, capable of maintaining temperature through momentary interruptions. They had thermal inertia, thermal stability, thermal memory. The workers who tended them understood this intuitively, even if they couldn't express it in engineering terms. They knew that a furnace, once heated, carried that heat forward through time, not just the obvious, visible heat of the burning charge, but the deeper, structural heat absorbed into the masonry over months of operation. They knew that shutting down such a furnace was not simply a matter of extinguishing the fire. It was initiating a slow surrender, a gradual release of stored energy that would continue for weeks, following pathways through the brick, obeying laws that operated at scales of mass and time beyond human perception. In October 1893, the workers at Riverside Iron Works waited 23 days for their furnace to cool. They waited because the structure required it, because the heat embedded in 400 tons of firebrick and 600 tons of backing brick could only dissipate at the rate that thermal conductivity, convection, and radiation allowed. They waited, and in waiting, they learned respect for the machines they operated, respect for the fact that these structures, though built by human hands, operated according to physical principles that existed before humanity and would continue after. The furnace that refused to cool was simply a furnace remembering how to be warm. And memory, whether in brick or in flesh, takes time to fade.